Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Canada is an Arctic nation, yet only a small percentage of Canadians really live there. So how do people living in southern Canada, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, learn about the unique and fascinating marine animals that inhabit this environment? Well, let me present the online Arctic Marine Life course. The course is supported by the Science in Canada's North Café Scientifique series, and we would like to acknowledge the support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation and the Canadian Association of Science Centres for their support. Our partners include the Alliance of Natural History Museums of Canada, Canada's Accredited Zoos and Aquariums, Telespark in Calgary, Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, and the Discovery Centre in Halifax. Keep track of the dates and locations of the presentation on our website, www.vanatqua.org/Arctic Marine Life Course. And if you miss a presentation, you can always watch it online after it's been recorded. If you have any questions about the course or would like to register for the course after it has started, you can contact Jonathan Hillquist at vanatqua.org. Our speaker now is Dr. Valeria Vergara, a research associate with the Vancouver Aquarium Marine Science Centre. She studied at the University of British Columbia and documented the rich repertoire of vocalization made by beluga calves. Valeria's research focuses on the behavioral ecology of cetaceans and particularly beluga whales. And over to you.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm very glad that Tess was here before me, giving you a sort of overview on Arctic cetaceans and especially beluga whales. So I'm going to skip the overview and go straight into beluga communication. I will give a few details about their lives in the Arctic and about their social ecology, but what you will hear from me today mostly has to do with the way these animals produce sounds. This is an extremely sound-centered species. Sound is absolutely vital to their survival. So a little bit about the range of beluga whales first. They are a circumpolar species. They live, of course, in the Arctic and subarctic oceans of Russia, Canada, the States, and Greenland and Norway. And there's a few subpopulations in the world, 29 to be exact, in the whole world, and 7 of those populations live in Canadian waters. A lot of them have been designed of special concern or endangered or threatened. The St. Lawrence beluga population actually, unfortunately, last year was downlisted, was uplisted to endangered again from threatened. The population has not been doing well since the 2000s or so. Belugas are very important to Inuit communities in the Arctic that use the skin and the blubber for nutrition. They call it maktak, and it is of fundamental importance to the lives of these communities. There's a lot that we have begun to understand about belugas in the past few years that is not related to sound. They are very social species. All of you probably know this. They are long-lived. They have very long mother-calf relationships and extended nursing. And in fact, they have something that in biology is called alloparental care. That means that females that are not necessarily related to the calf, sometimes they're aunties or older sisters, but sometimes they're not even related to the calf, act as babysitters and may even nurse the young, which is something that we observed here at the Vancouver Aquarium. They're migratory. They migrate a fairly long distance from areas of broken pack ice to very shallow estuaries where they raise their calves for the first few weeks of their lives. And there's genetic differentiation between the females that use different summering areas, and this is partly how scientists divide the subpopulations of beluga whales. And this is called phylopetry of females and their calves. And some behavioral differences in the way, for example, in the way belugas hunt have been described for different areas. males are larger than females, it's actually quite easy to tell males apart in the wild. They have larger heads, larger melons, and longer and bulkier bodies and bigger shoulders than females. And they are the only cetacean that sheds their skin, that molds their skin every summer, which might be one of the reasons why they enjoy shallow estuaries where they engage in a lot of rubbing on the sediment to help with this molting. They're very deep divers. Generally, they dive up to about 600 meters or so, but once in a while, very deep dives of up to 850 meters or so have been documented. And they have a very long gestation period, 14 to 15 months, and after that, they give birth to little calves that are usually dark, which is really interesting, much darker than the iconic white beluga is, but you do occasionally see very light-colored calves, as in these pictures. The main adaptations to the Arctic, they are white in color, so presumably that helps to camouflage against polar bears or killer whales, so they're predators. They don't have a dorsal fin. Narwhals don't have a dorsal fin either, and this probably allows them to move easily amongst the sea ice. And the main adaptation is sound. Now, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, really, close your eyes, and imagine that you are in dark waters trying to communicate with your peers. And without your peers, you could not survive. That your social group is absolutely everything to you, and the only way that you have to maintain contact with this group is by sound. You're hearing echolocation right now, mixed in with a lot of communication sounds. So that at the end was an echolocation terminal buzz, what people think has to do with the animal zoning in onto the prey. So really, to the human, to us, echolocation sounds a little bit like static. So really neat. They are quite a sound-centered species. They're called the sea canaries, for a reason. And yet, and there's a few things that we do know about their sounds. We know that they're extremely loquacious. We know that we know how to divide the major sound categories. So we know that they make whistles and pulse sounds and clicks, and sometimes they can combine clicks and pulse sounds into a single vocalization. We know that depending on the kind of behavior and social context that they engage in, they will make different sounds. We know that there's geographical differences in signal use between population. This was discovered for Russian belugas. And yet, we know extremely little about the function of all their sounds. We're talking about a species that has an enormous repertoire of sounds. They are the most vocal mammalian species after humans. So quite interesting. We know so little about what all these sounds are used for and how to categorize the sounds, whether they have individual differences in these sounds. And how is it that these animals develop their sounds? Are they born knowing this incredibly large repertoire of sounds, or do they have to learn it? How do they produce these sounds? And what are the details of their sound use in terms of the social relationships that they have with others? So all of these things were huge gaps in our understanding of their communication system, which mattered because we're dealing with an animal that is very sound-centered. And so to understand anything about the effects of noise, of underwater noise, on a species that basically relies on sound to survive, we need to understand what these sounds are all about. So I spent the past decade or so trying to understand a little bit more about this, about the meaning and the function and the development of beluga vocalizations. And I did this initially at the aquarium. I've studied a total of 8 belugas that were held here throughout the years. I was able to parse 28 different vocalizations, and when I talk about parsing vocalizations, I refer only to those calls that are very stereotyped, very discrete, and that you can hear over and over in the beluga whale repertoire. And these are just, I'm not going to play all 28, these are just some examples. Type B, type G, that's the chicken call. Type L, type N, type T, type U, W. So you can, I'm sure you can all tell how amazingly different these sounds are from one another, and how particular that last sound that I played was. It really sounded nothing like all the whistles and chirps typical of belugas, and that's the sound type that I focused on for a lot of my doctoral years. Essentially, these are broadband, we didn't know anything about these sounds before these studies here, and they're broadband, very biologically important sounds that serve to maintain contact between mothers and calves, and also between adults when group cohesion is important. And the next clip that I'm going to play, you're going to hear the mother, grandmother calling, and the calf clicking in the back. So contact calls are really easy to differentiate from the general background chatter of the species. And interestingly, little beluga calves are not born knowing these calls. I was able to follow the vocal development of a beluga calf named Tuvok that was born here at the aquarium in 2002. And the main findings were that Tuvok produced highly underdeveloped calls initially, and slowly he learned to incorporate other calls into his repertoire, and he learned to modify these calls so that they resembled adult calls. But that took time. And this may have to do with muscle control and muscle strength. So little calves are not born knowing how to control the muscles of their blowholes. And vocal learning may play a very significant role for this species. It's much like human babbling or birds of song. And when you think about vocal plasticity and social learning in marine mammals, you generally tend to see these traits in marine mammals that have characteristics like long-term mother-infant bonds and extended maturation periods, so the young are young for a long time, and long-term individual relationships and the long lives and multi-generation family groups. And beluga whales have all of these characteristics. So if there's a species that is suited for vocal plasticity and learning, that would be belugas. Now, what about wild whales? In 2005 or so, I think it was, I began to wonder what would happen if I took my studies to the wild and asked the same questions that I asked here at the aquarium, but out in the wild. And so I joined DFO and the Group for Research and Education of Marine Mammals in Quebec. And I was able to determine that both in Hudson Bay and in the St. Lawrence, these broadband contact calls are typical of situations where adults lose contact from one another. So I was able to verify that these contact calls that are so biologically important were not a product of captivity, but they exist in other wild populations. But I wasn't satisfied with that. And I thought, what would be the most perfect place to carry out a study of mother-calf communication? And that would be a beluga nursery. What you're hearing is a combination of very strong wind, Arctic wind, and some beluga calls that are coming up through speakers that I had placed on a platform that I had set up to study these whales. I was not more than 20 meters away from the whale So that was one of the most pristine nurseries that you could encounter. It is an area that has absolutely no boat traffic thus far. It's in the high Arctic. That I'm not sure if you can see that the white arrow pointing to the north of Somerset Island, an estuary called Cunningham Inlet, which is where about 2,000 whales come every year from the eastern high Arctic Baffin Bay population with their little calves to nurse, to socialize, to engage in skim molting. And it's really quite an extraordinary place for the whales themselves and for biologists to do behavioral work. But there's concerns about the impact of global warming on these and other beluga populations. The Arctic is melting at a very fast rate. It is actually warming up at twice the rate as the rest of the planet. And there's concern, like Tess mentioned before me, that this would create an increased exposure to all sorts of underwater noise simply because there's more access. What you're hearing is a clip recording in the St. Lawrence River Estuary on a very, very quiet morning. It was a group of males with no boats in the area. And 2 hours later, we were following the same group, and the area began to become very busy with all sorts of boat traffic, and this is what you could hear underwater. So I'm sure that you were able to pick out some of the beluga calls there, but it was difficult, and it's probably difficult for the whales too. It is a dire problem. So the main objective of carrying out this work in Cunningham Inlet is to understand how belugas communicate in the absence of noise, especially mothers and calves. And this is to provide a baseline against which the effects of noise on communication and behavior can be looked at in other areas that are already facing the noise that is associated with new development projects or with simply with human access. Now, a little bit more about contact calls. Why are they so fascinating, and why is it an interesting call to study? Contact calls are a call that has been singled out or isolated pretty much in every species, in every social species of bird and mammal that has been studied. And this goes for terrestrial mammals and marine mammals, including humans. So to illustrate the main characteristic of contact calls in talks, I recruited the help of my 9-year-old daughter. I took her to a park, and I told her to go to the other end of the playground. It was a really busy playground. There were moms eating sandwiches and dads talking and teenagers playing and little toddlers hanging out. It was a noisy place. And I asked her to call my name while I held my iPhone and recorded her on the other end of the playground. So what characterizes contact calls, I think this really makes the point, is that you can really pick out a contact call from the background of the species chatter. A contact call tends to be stereotyped, tends to be repeated over and over again. This goes for humans, for belugas, and for all of the species for which contact calls have been identified. Along the same lines, you can probably tell apart by now the contact calls in beluga playgrounds or beluga nursery areas. They are just calls that are very different from the rest of the species repertoire, and they are absolutely critical to maintain contact for that species. They're what glues the society together. So this was my research site, 2014. I arrived to a very frozen Arctic and very different scenario on very similar dates. In 2015, there was not a single a little piece of ice, so it was a lot more comfortable to start my study this season. And how is it that I did this? I used a hydrophone, very broadband, calibrated hydrophone that allowed me to pick out not just the low frequencies, but the very high frequencies that belugas produce. And I used an iPad for behavioral observations, so quite a change from back in my time when I would take behavioral notes on pencil and then have to transcribe them. This really saves a step. There's some challenges of working in the Arctic. This was in the evening, I think around 9 o'clock at night, I decided to string out the hydrophone and leave it overnight, recording. I was very excited to wake up the next, to see what I would have the next morning. But the next morning, the ice had drifted and the hydrophone had gotten entangled in the ice, and I had to spend a couple of hours disentangling the hydrophone from the ice. So it is the Arctic. But I managed to, despite the challenges, I managed to get wonderful data. This is an aerial view of the delta, and this gives you an idea of how large the area is. And the little white arrows indicate all the possible places where beluga whales would congregate on any given day. And the research cliff and the research tower are indicated by the circle. So on any given morning, I would wake up, take a look at the area, and decide where to hike. And this video, it's a little broken up, but it illustrates just how large the delta really is and how many whales congregate there on any given day. Very soon after my arrival on both seasons, we built a research tower, which was great because you would access this tower at low tide, and then the tide would slowly surround the tower, and the whales would surround the tower, and you could watch them much more efficiently from an elevation. And so this is the view from the tower when you're looking at these animals from 3 meters above the water into the water. It just becomes a lot easier to see how many calves there are and things like that. Another way to do this, to get an accurate count of the animals, is to attach a GoPro to the end of a very long pole and just kind of take video like that, and that worked. And a great thing, at least for the biologists, that happened both years, both seasons that I was there, but especially in 2015, is that whales would get entrapped in river canals. And, I don't think they stressed too much about it. They were able to get out after a few hours. But the fact was that these canals would get separated from the rest of the herd by a sandbank. And so this allowed me to know exactly the size and the composition of the group that I was recording, which is something that is nearly impossible to do when you're studying cetaceans. So it was wonderful to be able to do this. And when the whales are in an entrapment situation, they produce mostly broadband pulsed contact calls. So essentially, from a sample of almost 7,000 vocalizations analyzed in delta sessions from the larger herd, about 10% of the vocalizations are contact calls, but in an entrapment situation, about 70% of the calls are contact calls, which is great because what I want is data on contact calls. This video was taken with the GoPro. What you're hearing are contact calls of a group of about 19 whales entrapped in this canal. So really, really great data that I have yet to analyze in detail. They are shallow water whales, and I mean shallow water whales. They really hang out in a foot of water, and they do this over and over again all over the delta. It is a wonderful sight to see. They really seem to enjoy themselves. It's really evident that they must derive some kind of benefit other than pure pleasure, such as, for instance, maybe helping with the skin molting. There's a camera going off there. But sometimes they do misjudge the height of tides, and they get stranded. This is a video of a stranding in 2014. You can see the adult wrapping her tail around the little calf, which is something that occurred periodically throughout the 4 hours that I watched this stranding, conceivably for the adult to help this calf out. Some of the highlights of the data that I collected, very high frequency echolocation, and echolocation happening at all times, which is probably, if you think of whales navigating in very, very shallow canals and in this shallow estuary, they use echolocation to navigate and to find their way and to avoid getting stranded, which, you know, sometimes they can't help it. But also to find prey. That is echolocation slowed down 10 times so that we can hear it. Otherwise, we would not even be able to hear this. Another very key finding is that little calves produce contact calls or produce calls that are at much lower frequencies than the calls of adults and that are much harder to hear. And they sound like somebody's running a finger through a comb. I'll play it again for you. So that's a calf call. This was confirmed with the entrapments. So I basically looked at entrapments that had neonates in them versus entrapments that didn't, and found that these calls were produced only in those entrapments that had little neonates with them. And this is key because this frequency of vocalizations that neonates produce overlaps the main kind of propeller cavitation noise of boats. So boats could mask the vocalizations of young calves. And so this is where my study of belugas goes to the St. Lawrence River Estuary, where I spent 2 weeks this year planning a study that will hopefully start next year, funding permitting. This is a population that is endangered currently, and there has been an unexplained calf mortality. Little calves are being found dead in unprecedented numbers. These are newborns that we're talking about, and necropsies don't indicate that there's any pathological reasons for these mortalities. And so one idea might be that there's an increased rate of mother-calf separation. And so the question is the incredible amount of noise that these animals face in this area compromising mother-calf acoustic contact? So that is the question. Like I said, I spent the end of August and beginning of September trying to figure out what would be a good protocol to answer this question. And I will leave you with my favorite video of one of my favorite times up in the high Arctic. This was at midnight, believe it or not. So there is no night in the Arctic in July. And I spent a long time watching these very social whales. And again, how belugas use sound is a really, really important aspect of their ecology that we need to understand if we're going to understand anything about how underwater noise is affecting them. Thank you very much for being here tonight, and so many people and associations to help, especially my daughter Martina and the dog Cargo, the whale finder. She came with me to the field for the first time this year, and it was wonderful. Thank you. Yes, questions, please.
We actually have a question from an online viewer.
Great.
Who is wondering if the calls being played, are they all real time and real frequency, or is it been changed?
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. Oh, the question asked was, did I modify the calls being played here for you in any way, or are the calls played at the true frequencies and true times? The only thing that I modified is the echolocation clip. If I had not slowed it down 10 times, you would not have been able to hear it. But in terms of communication calls, belugas make sounds that are quite audible to humans. They just have portions of those sounds that extend into inaudible ranges. But in terms of whistles and chirps, for instance, they're quite audible. They make a lot of pulsed sounds that are not audible to humans. Yeah. So if boat noise is causing trouble in the St. Lawrence population, if there's anything we can do about it, and that's a great question, and there's many things we can do about it, starting with mitigation measures that are based on real life data. You know, how close can we get to the whales without disturbing them? Do we need to separate particular nursing areas and leave those areas alone? Can we make boat engines quieter, and so forth? Yes.
Just on boat engines, I mean, submarines are absolutely silent.
Exactly.
It's just a matter of cost of flying the hulls of the pile, things like that. So there are solutions. It's just more research has to be done to be able to demonstrate that the noise is interfering. I think the solution.
That's right. So just in a nutshell, some boats are already very quiet. Submarines are very quiet. The technology is there. It's just expensive, and it is true. And I know that there are some ferry companies that are going green and are doing their best to have that kind of technology in place. So it is doable. Thank you, everybody, and I'll stay out here for a little bit if you think of any other questions you'd like to ask me after the talk. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today. The Vancouver Aquarium Marine Science Centre is a not-for-profit organization committed to conserving aquatic life. If you'd like to support the aquarium and its programs, you can visit our website at www.vanaqua.org. Thank you.